How's this? This sounds all right?
Yeah.
Back?
That's okay.
Thank you all for coming. How are you?
Good.
Thanks, Holly. That's a nice touch with the music at the forum, and thank you and congratulations to Broke, not just for this invitation to join you tonight, but really thanks for all that you've been doing for the last couple of years and the leadership that you've shown on this important file. And thanks also to the city of Burnaby. I think the city of Burnaby has shown extraordinary leadership on this issue of thanks to Audrey for the acknowledgement at the beginning. You know, sometimes these acknowledgements that were gathered on Coast Salish unceded territory, they feel pro forma. It really matters. And I think it matters not just in the belief that recognizing Aboriginal rights and title, it's not just about honoring our past and our present, but it's also of direct relevance to the topic that brings us together tonight. Because I'm convinced that the exercising of rights and title is ultimately going to play a vital role in saving our collective bacon when it comes to climate change. So I see some supporters here. How many of you are actually supporters of the CCPA? Okay, a few of you. I don't know, and are some of you, I'm assuming a fair number of you are quite familiar with the CCPA, but for those of you who aren't, as Carl said, we are Canada's foremost progressive public policy research institute. When I have to say in a sentence what it is that we do, I say we produce and promote research that aims to show people that our best values are still possible. That in the face of these unrelenting messages that we hear all the time, that we can't afford our most cherished...
What does CCP stand for?
Sorry, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And so we're a non-profit charity, a public policy think tank, and we cover a whole range of issues and try to do work that shows people we can still afford to pay for our most treasured social programs like healthcare and education. We can afford to take better care of one another. We can still do those things. We're most known as a social justice research institute. But for the last 8 years, we've also been doing a lot on climate and have been hosting this project called the Climate Justice Project, a research and public engagement network that has produced a large volume of work on how to transition off of fossil fuels in a just and equitable manner. An alliance that brings together a whole range of environmental NGOs and anti-poverty groups and academics working together on this file. We have spent the last 8 years really seeking to answer one overarching question, which is what will our province look like when we have dramatically reduced our greenhouse gas emissions, getting to carbon zero by mid-century, but done so in a manner that reduces inequality and ensures that the societal and industrial transitions are just and equitable, because of course it could go either way. So I want to share with you some of the work of the Climate Justice Project, and in particular highlight the work of one of our research associates, the retired earth scientist David Hughes, who has spent the last 32 years working for he's retired, but has spent 32 years working for the Geological Survey of Canada, where he focused on unconventional gas and oil and coal research. And also the work of our senior economist, Mark Lee, in our office, who heads up the Climate Justice Project. And I also want to offer up my own thoughts on the Trans Mountain Pipeline proposal. So I think at the root of this whole issue of the Kinder Morgan proposal is what I call the new climate denialism. For decades, of course, we were dealing with a more traditional form of climate denialism, and it was stymieing climate action for decades. In an effort to create public confusion and stall political progress, the fossil fuel industry poured tens of millions of dollars into the pockets of foundations and think tanks and lobby groups and politicians and academics who relentlessly questioned the overwhelming scientific evidence that human-caused climate change is real and requires urgent action. Thankfully, the climate deniers have mostly been exposed and repudiated. Earlier this year, ExxonMobil who were among the leading architects and funders of the denial industry, even became the focus of a U.S. fraud investigation earlier this year, when it was revealed that the company not only knew about the dangers of climate change as far back as 1977, but it pioneered some of the earliest research about its existence. So these days, relatively few politicians express misgivings about the reality and science of climate change, the current Republican nominee for president being a notable exception. Our own Prime Minister and really all the Canadian premiers, except arguably Saskatchewan's Brad Wall, publicly recognize the reality of climate change and have stated in their platforms and in their throne speeches that they are committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the good news. The bad news is that we face this new form of climate denialism, and it's more nuanced and insidious, but it's just as dangerous. And in this new form of denialism, the fossil fuel industry and our political leaders assure us that they understand and accept the scientific warnings about climate change, but they are in denial about what that scientific reality means for policy and continue to block progress. So here at home, we have the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, and if you go to their webpage, they represent all the leading industry players. You go to their website, you're going to see that they recognize the importance of climate change as a global issue requiring action. It sounds great. And yet CAP continues to push hard for expanded oil sands production and new pipelines on behalf of its members. Claiming that we can take effective action on climate change on the one hand, and yet also ramp up fossil fuel production at the same time. It's what Mark Lee, our senior economist, calls the all-of-the-above policymaking. It's what Prime Minister Trudeau and Premier Notley are doing when they say that we can have carbon pricing and various regulations on the one hand, while at the same time supporting expanded tar sands production and new bitumen pipelines. It's what's at play with yesterday's announcement about Petronas and LNG. It's what Premier Clark is doing when she proclaims that BC can be a climate leader while at the same time pursuing a ramp up in natural gas fracking and the development of an LNG export industry. And it's what Canada's doing when we sign the Paris Agreement on climate while failing to adopt the policies that we need to keep global temperatures below 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And on a related front, this new climate denialism operates, I think, hand in glove with Indigenous rights and title denialism. Same sort of story, where we live in this interesting political space, where our politicians claim to accept recent court rulings and the historic reality of our Aboriginal rights and title. We have a new federal government that's promised to adopt the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous people, UNDRIP, and say they're going to bring that lens to all of their work. But again, our governments are unwilling to accept what rights and title mean in practical policy terms. And Indigenous rights denialism particularly finds expression when it runs up against the interests and power of the corporate fossil fuel sector. And we see both Indigenous rights denialism and climate denialism at play in particular in these fights over pipelines, and most notably in the Kinder Morgan fight, where numerous First Nations along the route, and in particular the Tsleil-Waututh Nation here at the inlet, have said no. And when the climate science is telling us that this is fundamentally at odds with Canada's commitment to lower its greenhouse gas emissions. And so it's baffling about what parts of the climate science and Aboriginal rights and title are confusing here. And yet there you go. Now, here's the thing. Acting according to climate science and our Paris commitments, it doesn't mean we have to turn off the tap tomorrow on the oil sands. We have transition time. But it does mean that we have to manage for a planned 30-year wind down. And if that's the case, it makes no economic or ecological sense to spend billions of dollars on new fossil fuel infrastructure and increasing capacity, particularly when that infrastructure has a working lifespan and expected financial returns that well exceed 30 years. You know, infrastructure like pipelines and the decisions that we make about infrastructure like this, they matter because they lock in place a certain development path. If we know that we need to set out on a path towards fossil fuel wind down, now is not the time to be investing in new infrastructure that aims towards ramp up. Infrastructure decisions, they tend to create their own logic, their own raison d'etre, their own variation of what, well, as of last week, the late W.P. Kinsella would have called, if you build it, they will come. Meaning if it's built, it is because the interest behind it likely don't believe the promise of the Notley government that oil sands production will stop at 100 megatons of GHGs. They are making a deeply cynical calculation that when the time comes, that's going to be exceeded, and that new pipeline capacity will be used. They're kind of ragging the puck, if you will, on the current political reality. In the case of this proposal, the logic and the raison d'etre of expanding this pipeline are fundamentally at odds with the clear direction that we need to take. So I want to focus on this recent paper that we published for a moment now by David Hughes. It was published in June. It's up on our website, and the title is called "Can Canada Expand Oil and Gas Production, Build Pipelines, and Keep Its Climate Commitments?" I'm not going to leave you in suspense. The answer is no. So David's paper has many interesting findings that I recommend it all to you. But the two key findings are these. One, Canada cannot expand oil sands production as is currently seeking, while still meeting its Paris commitments. To do so would mean all other sectors of the economy would be required to reduce emissions at a scale and speed that is simply not realistic. And two, this is perhaps the most interesting finding out of this study, which I'm going to show you, which is that if one reviews all of the pipeline and rail capacity for oil exports out of Alberta that already exist, even under the Alberta government's plan to increase and then cap oil sands emission at 100 megatons per year, we already have all of the transportation infrastructure we need. The green there represents all of our existing pipeline and rail capacity. That dotted line there is capturing current production levels and then Rachel Notley's increase and flattening out. All these pipelines that we're having these big old fights over, Keystone, Enbridge, Energy East, and of course Kinder Morgan, are all surplus and redundant to what we actually need, even with that 45% increase over 2014 production under the Notley plan. So I also want to address a core argument made by proponents of Trans Mountain, namely that Alberta and Canada need more what's called access to tidewater in order to capture a higher international price for oil and thus increase public returns. Now, this argument may briefly have been true at some point. It is not true now. So David Hughes shared this with me as well. So this is a slide that's looking at, over the last number of years, the price differential between the global Brent price for oil and the North American West Texas Intermediate price. Now, in the NEB review of Kinder Morgan, they were relying on an economic report from Muse Consulting, they were called. And the Muse Consulting report, upon which that NEB review was relied, was premised on oil prices in 2012 and 13. But the problem, as you see here, is that 2011 to 13 were really peak years in terms of the differential between the North American and the global price for oil. They weren't the norm. They were exceptional. And importantly, the disparity between the North American and international oil price in those years was due mainly to a bottleneck in Cushing, Oklahoma, which has since been relieved. I don't want to get too technical, but basically they completed the Seaway pipeline and the southern leg of Keystone XL from Cushing to the Gulf Coast. And so that price differential, as you see, ends up evaporating. And it no longer covers the cost of transporting Alberta bitumen to Tidewater. the market has already moved to bring prices into alignment. So when our governments, in the face of all of these people in Alberta who are really feeling anxious, right? Feeling anxious about their economic security. And when they're told, well, access to Tidewater will be your ticket out. That's a false hope. That's not true. Now let me highlight a couple of pieces of Mark's work. First, Mark has done calculations of what new pipeline capacity can mean with respect to GHG emissions. And so you see some of that here. The middle column there is for Kinder Morgan. Mark's conservative estimate is that new oil sands production associated with the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, just the expansion, not the current one, would represent an additional 93 megatons of global GHG emissions per year. Let me put 93 megatons in perspective for you. Compare that with total annual emissions for our entire province of 63 megatons. Or put another way, that 93 megatons is equivalent to 13% of the annual emissions for all of Canada. This is not the direction that we want to go. Second, I recommend to you a paper Mark wrote back in 2012 about the proposed Enbridge Northern Gateway Pipeline, and I do so because it offers some very interesting analysis of the promised jobs that would result from these pipelines. In short, Mark's paper highlights the ways in which the proponents of often overstate how many jobs would be produced. He also looks at the jobs placed at risk in the event of spills or major leaks. And finally, he looks at how many jobs are produced for each major, $1 million invested in the fossil fuel sector compared to the alternatives. And I want to show that to you here. So this table is capturing how many jobs do you get for $1 million of investment. There's your fossil fuel sectors there. You basically get 2 or fewer jobs per $1 million of investment. These are very capital intensive industries. Compared to all of these other sectors, that are mostly lower emissions. Look at education, 25 jobs per the same level of investment, $1 million of investment. Waste management, 20 jobs. Repairs and maintenance, 17 jobs. Health and social services, 15. A much better rate of return. So we need to be making different choices. We at the CCBA, we call this our carbon crossroads moment. Really a choice between doubling down on fossil fuels and making as much money as we can in the short term, or we could choose another path and make serious changes in order to meet our GHG reduction targets. And the bulk of our work is about exploring what that other route looks like. Our work acknowledges that this is a bit scary, right? It's filled with a lot of unknowns. People have a lot of questions. What's my community and home going to look like? Where's my food going to come from? How will I make a living? How the heck are we going to pay for all of this? Now, if I were giving a full climate justice presentation, I would walk you through the work we've done in answer to all of these questions. But just for tonight only, I want to focus just on that question of work, because I think that's what's holding us back, and the promise that these pipeline companies make around jobs. And jobs matter. It's key to a good life. But I think we're often told we have to choose between climate and jobs. I don't think so. Let me show you this. Here's some interesting numbers. The reality is that the biggest emitters, so these are key industries. You see mining and oil and gas are the biggest source of emissions in British Columbia. Also tend to be very small employers. Our biggest employment's in the service sector, which is already very low emitting. So what might a bold climate action jobs plan look like? There are concrete things that we can do right now. First, we can develop green infrastructure jobs that directly lower our emissions. The lowest hanging fruit there are jobs in building retrofits, clean energy, transit infrastructure. Second, we can invest more and certainly stop cutting and selling off public services and social infrastructure. Environmentalists don't usually mention it, but teaching and caring for kids doesn't burn much carbon, or caring for the sick. And of course, these are the very sectors that are relentlessly under attack by cost-cutting politicians. If we had the $10 a day childcare plan, that could produce well over 40,000 jobs per year in British Columbia. Third, climate change is happening now. So adaptation work is increasingly important. We're building dikes, water and sewer upgrades, all manner of maintenance and repair and other adaptation infrastructure. Fourth, we need to pursue apprenticeship and training opportunities for traditionally disadvantaged populations, as well as those who are currently employed in the fossil fuel sector, and ensure that just transition policies are in place for them with training and income support and relocation support and so on. Fifth, we need to rethink our resources and stop treating all the resource sectors as if they're the same. Because while we want to wind down oil and gas, sustainable forestry can and should have a bright future in our province if we invest in it. It's part of the climate solution. And work that we've done by Ben Parfit in our office shows that if we start reinvesting in our forests and reforestation and value-added production, we could create over 20,000 more jobs in these, closer to where people actually live. So put another way, green investments yield 3 to 30 times more direct jobs than fossil fuel industries do. The hard part here is that fossil fuel companies are putting billions of dollars on the table, so we have to match that with these public investments. And the jobs that I'm talking about in building retrofits and renewable energy and transit infrastructure and social services and adaptation infrastructure and forestry, they can and should be in all parts of the province. If you want to learn more about those, they're highlighted in a bunch of climate justice reports we have, and I have a few copies of some of them. Just a final thought. This is a quote from the American historian Howard Zinn. There's a tendency to think that what we see as the present moment will continue. We forget how often we've been astonished by the sudden crumbling of institutions, by extraordinary changes in people's thoughts, in unexpected eruptions of rebellion against tyrannies, by the quick collapse of systems of power that seemed invincible, like the fossil fuel sector. What leaps out from history in the past 100 years is its utter unpredictability. You know, talking honestly about climate change and Indigenous rights means what that means for public policy. It's admittedly challenging, and the public is nervous, and many people are anxious about their economic security and jobs. So it's understandable that many of our politicians feel this gravitation to an all-the-above approach. But real leadership requires a different kind of conversation. One where we speak frankly about the scope of transformational change that lies before us in the next 30 years. You know, when a friend is in denial about an addiction that they can't bring themselves to confront, true friends don't show empathy by turning a blind eye to that destructive behavior. Real friends make an intervention and they tell the truth. It may be difficult to imagine a world that isn't dependent on fossil fuels, or a future where Indigenous peoples exercise their full historic rights. And there's no doubt that it's going to take hard work. But I'll leave you with this thought. For many of us in this room, our young children or grandchildren have never known smoking to be allowed in restaurants or seat belts to not be required. Both of these things, if you remember, some of us do, these were fiercely resisted, and now they're the new normal. And their kids aren't going to know what a gas station is except what they see in old movies. The reality of climate change means that one way or another, that next generation is going to live through an industrial revolution in high speed. That's just a fact. Our leaders need to move past these incarnations of denialism and focus on making that transition in a bold and just manner. Thanks.
So the first question is, you've referred to, you said we have transition time, but the IPCC report says that even if we cut off emissions tomorrow totally, the temperature would still rise by 1.5 Celsius by 2100. So do we in fact have transition time? Second question is, does your presentation sort of parallel the LEAP manifesto?
On the second question, are there parallels here with the LEAP? Yes, there are parallels with the LEAP. It's my little sister, what can I say? And so we did publish a thing I wrote on how to pay for the LEAP, and because she asked, and when my little sister asked me to do something like that, I'm just going to say yes, all right? And actually, when I was shortening my speech, I cut out a few slides from the LEAP. There are parallels because the LEAP, like my talk, says the one thing that's clear. Look, the transition time that we have has some unknowns. what we know for sure is that we shouldn't be investing in new infrastructure because that sets us in the wrong direction. And it's surprising to me that that piece of the league has been as contentious as it has proven to be, because there is no arguing the science that now is not the time to be investing in new infrastructure. And so there are parallels. The elite, as we do at CCP and the Climate Justice Project, effectively says we need to be carbon zero by 2040 or 2050. That's why I talk about this 30-year period. How steep that needs to come down? Probably pretty steep. And we're all living in this ambiguous time where we're not sure if we're going to get where we need to go fast enough. And all we can do, like Kate said, is try our best, and maybe our grandkids will have to figure out some technology to suck a bunch of carbon out of the air. But our obligation is to give them a running chance at that. Whether or not this is sort of this whole double standard is sort of confusion by design, maybe in part with some. I mean, my sense of politics is that there's always a whole raft of contradictory stuff at play and conflicting forces, and there are some in any given cabinet who know this is all BS, and others who actually feel passionate about this. When I looked at yesterday's LNG announcement, Catherine McKenna looked pretty unhappy. That's what she looked to me, because I think she knows. And how those battles will play out, I think, to harken back to where Kate left us, will depend on us.